Hello, it's Dr. Bennett here to talk to you about modernism. Modernism follows realism. Realism, of course, runs post-Civil War through Civil War up through about the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. Modernism begins in the United States, at least, around the time that World War I begins, and it runs up until the 60s when the Civil Rights Movement began, and we begin a new era, postmodernism at that point. So with our focus on modernism, I want to talk about some of the reasons for the shift away from realism. First of all, World War I had left people feeling pretty devastated. If you've studied that war in your history classes, you know that the losses were incredible. You know, we had trench warfare, we had new machines, we had tanks, and the loss of life was so great that it caused people to sort of take a second look and wonder, are we really making progress as a species? So with that came a commitment by artists to experiment with form and try to find new forms that might better capture the human experience. Whereas, let's say, the epic would be a kind of a retelling of the hero's tale, let's say, or the sentimental novel would reinforce the idea that if you're a good person, good things will happen to you. The modernists said, you know, even the old forms, even the old kinds of stories that we've told, and the old kinds of poems like sonnets and epic poems, they no longer work. They are not helping us find a way to move into our futures. So our job is going to be to experiment and see if we can find those. And this experimentation was happening both with writers and also visual artists, and even with musicians and theater. It was just in a way, a kind of a time of great innovation. And another reason that we were shifting gears a little bit is because we were still learning more about the human mind and how we process information. So psychologists were understanding more and more about how kind of thoughts are formed, for example, and they began to think of them as being almost fluid. That you had a conscious mind and you had a subconscious mind, and that there's this kind of fluid interplay between them. So the flowing nature of that way that we process the world was subjective. So we're moving back toward the subjective, kind of an emphasis on how each individual understands the world because of their interpretation, their way of seeing the world. We are going to be reading in this class examples of some modernist writers. We're going to start with Robert Frost. Robert Frost does not experiment a lot with form. He's kind of at the beginning of this movement. But he is modernist in the way he looks at the world. So even though we think of him as a nature poet, and he is a nature poet, he does have a kind of cynicism about the world. He's not really believing in afterlife, for example. You'll see if you read closely. Sometimes when you're reading, you think, "Oh, what a nice old man." But if you read closely, you'll see that he is not painting a picture where there is a heaven, for example, after life. And in the poem Design, you'll see that he's even asking some very hard questions about what kind of creator might have created this universe, for example. So he is modernist in his perspective on the world. We're also going to be reading T.S. Eliot, and he is a kind of a poster child of modernism. He definitely experiments with form in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is the poem we're going to be reading. You'll see that it's free verse and it kind of meanders. The line kind of meanders in the same way that Prufrock, the character in the poem, meanders. And the aimlessness of Prufrock is very characteristic of modernism. This sense that they're not really sure what direction to go in. They can't quite take a hold of life. There's a little bit of angst there. And then the third person we're going to be reading is William Faulkner, we're going to be reading his story Barn Burning, and in that story you'll get an example of how stream of consciousness narrative technique works. Sometimes we're in Sardi's mind and it feels like we're kind of in a river of thought, a flow of thought. At the beginning, the story opens and he can smell cheese, and he's at the trial of his father, and yet that hunger that he's feeling is part of the whole experience. So that's sort of the example of how the mind is processing the information and figuring into his interpretation of the world. So some of the examples that you're going to see in the new forms of modernism include free verse, as we mentioned, stark, clear images in the poems. Rather than kind of storytelling, it'll be a real hard image, and also stream of consciousness narrative. Some of the key modernists that were writing during the period were not all American, right? We had some famous American writers who fall into that camp, including Amy Lowell, who was a poet, T.S. Eliot, whom we're reading, Wallace Stevens was a famous American modernist, and Ernest Hemingway. You might have read some of Hemingway's things, like Hills Like White Elephants. But also in England, we have Virginia Woolf, James Joyce. Sometimes England tries to claim T.S. Eliot, but he was born in the U.S. He finally moved to Great Britain later on. And there are modernists from all over the world as well. Some of the key themes to be looking for in the modernist texts that you're reading. One is that the past does not have a linear relationship to the present and the future. If we think that we're making progress as humans, we sometimes think of time as being linear, right? Like a timeline. Like we have the dark ages, and then we're moving closer and closer toward a better world. The modernists question this idea. They aren't so sure we're moving toward a better world, but also they start to understand that the past is really a construct of our minds. That we interpret the past from where we are now, and we think about it as being, maybe less civilized, but that's partly because of what we bring to the question, right? It's how our minds work. We also, another theme is that we have a subjective relationship to reality. We can't just be like a lens looking onto reality and describe it objectively. I mean, we can try, but generally speaking, we bring baggage, right? We bring a filter to our experience. So the only way we know our world is through each of our own filters, and that is a kind of subjective understanding of what's out there. And finally, a mistrust of the old mythologies, for example, Christianity. King Arthur and his knights, any of those kind of myths that teach us how to be noble humans, how to understand our place in the world, they no longer trust those. And so they begin to experiment in their stories with trying to find a new way forward. How do we understand what kind of values we should be embracing? The characters that you're going to find in these stories and poems are often kind of angst-ridden. They're desperately looking for meaning in a world where they're not sure there is meaning. The settings are often wastelands, deserts. Faulkner's settings are in the south, but they're in this kind of fetid, kind of decaying, you imagine like a barn that's being taken down by kudzu. That kind of, the old South kind of rotting there in the same way. That the old myths of the South, for example, also can't lead us forward. And then finally, the narrative styles that you're going to see the stream of consciousness. One of the reasons for that is that the writers are very interested in the process of the human consciousness, and so they're going to be trying to kind of explore that with their narratives. And you'll see that in Barn Burning. You'll see Sardi's mind working. So that is an introduction to modernism. Be sure and look at the presentation so that you can go back and get some kind of a recap of some of these things, and that'll be a place to go back to as you try to interpret the stories and the poems that we're reading. But I really hope you'll enjoy modernism. It can seem kind of weird. It's sort of like maybe this painting behind me. Sort of, sorry, wrong way. It may not look like reality as we see it, as we look out the window, but there is often some kind of subconscious truths coming through in the imagery. Sometimes dream imagery is characteristic of modernism. So open your mind, try to enjoy it. I think the visual art of the modernist era is incredibly fascinating. So, rather than sort of thinking about how uncomfortable it makes you feel or how you're not quite sure what it means, just try to open up your experience to it and try to enjoy it. All right, and we will talk again soon.